The 7 are, I listed them here somewhere, Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom, Sirach, and Baruch. Those are the 7. They've been in existence for some time. So when the 4th century came along, the church, in discerning what they believed to be divinely inspired, accepted those 7. Yes, we believe those are divinely inspired. And so that was the Bible. 46 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. That's the way it stayed until the 16th century, when we had the Protestant Reformation. And Martin Luther, I don't know if he was the only one, but at least him. And I'm honestly not certain of the reason, but he did not, he threw out those 7. Nah, I'm not going to include those. And he didn't believe them to be divinely inspired, probably. Short check. But
Because when you start your own church, you can do whatever you want.
anyway, that's what happened.
Were those 7, were they written in a different language from
No. The Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. The New Testament was all originally written in Greek. Okay. But at any rate, he excluded them. And then they began to, have other versions of the Bible that put 7 fewer books in the Old Testament. And that difference carries over yet today. So that's why there's a difference. You will see a few Protestant Bibles that will list the 7 and refer to them as the deuterocanonical books. Some of them will do that. Okay? Questions on any of that so far? Okay. So how do Catholics look at the Bible? Well, truthfully, there's a lot of good biblical scholarship that's Catholic and Protestant. There are some, and this is true of Catholics and Protestants, really, who approach Scripture in a literal, word-for-word fashion. There are passages you can, but it's pretty hard to do that with all of it. So for example, I guess everyone familiar with, there's Jesus often used what we call parables. So one of the better known, I guess, of those is it's usually called the prodigal son. Familiar with that? It's a parable, okay? So do you think that there really was a man and he really did have 2 sons and the young one really did run off and squander his inheritance and all that? Were they actual historical figures? Of course not. That's what a parable is. You're telling us a fictitious story to make a point. But they're not actual historical figures. Jesus did that a lot. Well, you certainly can't take those passages to be history. It's just not. It's just not. And actually, you can't really, and this is the way I find it sort of amusing, really. You flip on the History Channel, and they've got this show on the Bible. Search for Noah's Ark, or they're dredging the Red Sea to try to find the pieces of the chariots of the Egyptians. something, Well, the Bible is not a history book. It does have some history in it, but it wasn't written to be a history book. That's not the purpose. We tend to look at it that way because we tend to be scientific and technological and historical, but that was not the culture of the Old Testament times nor the New Testament times. That was not the way those people thought. They weren't formed by that like we are. They very often told stories. So parables was not an unusual thing at all that Jesus was doing to make a point. And we still do stuff like that. All kinds of fiction books that have a point, or short stories or what have you. They were interested in communicating the truth, absolutely, but not trying to give an exact historical account. That's just not what the Bible is about. And so to approach it word for word, all of it, or as a history book, probably not gonna get as much out of it as you could. I say this in Bible study. They can testify to this, that because I remind them when people start down that path. Not a history book. Not a history book. But it is helpful, and I think your leaflet points this out, to try to put it in its historical context. Now, that is helpful sometimes. That is helpful sometimes. Like, for example, to understand King David is one of those huge figures in the Old Testament. Okay. Well, that there was actually two kingdoms. There was the northern one, Israel, and the southern one, Judah. Jerusalem was in Judah. For the majority of their history, they had a king of each. A unified king was a very, very short span of time. It was David and Solomon, and that was it. At most 70 or 80 years. But that was their golden age. They looked at it as kind of their golden age. They had a unified king. Well, when you start to understand that, or you start to understand, say, the writings of the prophet Isaiah, and he's talking about all this vindication, and I'm going to blast these people, and I'm going to do this, and pull these suckers down, and but all these people over here, I'm going to restore you, and I'm going to do all these wonderful things. It's going to be like water in the desert. You've got to understand the historical context is that those people were in, we were talking about this week, those people were in exile and been conquered by the Babylonians. And when one army in ancient times conquered another, it was not pretty at all. They absolutely ravaged the resources of the place and the people. They took many of them back out of their homeland, back to Babylon, and made them slaves. And generations passed before they got to come home. That was the historical context. So you can understand the prophecy, and it's not so much literal, but the real purpose is give these people some hope. They are hurting. This is awful. There's no end in sight here. My great-great-great-grandchildren are still subject to these Babylonians. Are we ever going to get to come home? written to say, God will deliver you. Fear not. Take heart. God will deliver you. Maybe not as quick as they'd like. God will deliver. So you get the point, though, where there is a historical context, but what's in there isn't exactly intended to be an historical account. Okay? And so that's how we approach Scripture. There's a lot that goes into it. I think it's important to read it as a story. Remember back to English 101, when you diagram the stories and the sentences and all that stuff. Who are the characters? Who are the main characters? What was the plot? What was the conflict? How did it get resolved? Remember all that stuff? Same thing. It's a story. What happened? Who are the characters? What was the conflict? How did it get resolved? It's a story. So we Catholics don't just approach it literally word for word, but we do, and you can get different things out of Scripture, can't you? You can read the same passage now, and 3 years from now, you might get something different out of it, 3 years from now. The Word of God truly is living, breathing, really. We're never going to exhaust it. It ain't going to happen. We're never going to get to the bottom. It's an endless mine of riches, you guys know.
But as you said in Bible study, some people will build this. Well, I'm going to read, whatever page I come to, and they'll read a passage out of there. But in order to really find the context that passage comes from, you need to read what happened before and what happened afterwards,
It's helpful.
And need to read about what the author, what he was thinking, when he was writing it,
Absolutely. So I'm sure you've heard people do this. They're mad. Well, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. It's in the Bible. It's justifying the vengeance that they want to take. Yeah, it does say that, but why don't you look at the whole passage?
turn the other cheek. Maybe that needs to be right next to the eye for an eye.
Yeah, look at the New Testament. Right. I tell you, bless your persecutors, pray for your enemies. So we don't just go at it from a literal word-for-word basis. Okay? Is that registering? No. Okay. What we read from at Mass is taken from the Bible, but it is not the Bible per se. It comes from a book called the Lectionary. Okay? It's called that because it comes from the Latin word lexio, which simply means to read. So the person that does it is called the lector, and the book that they're contained in is the Lectionary. Okay? But never that is not big to do. Here's how the lectionary is laid out, and to be honest with you, it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. The Sunday readings that we talked about last week when we touched on about Mass, we hear 4 selections from Scripture every Sunday. We hear a first reading most of the time from the Old Testament, Easter time from Acts of the Apostles. We hear from the book of Psalms, one of the 150 Psalms. And we hear from the New Testament, most of the time one of the letters of Paul, but sometimes others. And then the last reading is always